Hello, I'm Donna Phelan. My very special guest was just a child and home alone with her little brother when the Nazis burst into her home on Kristallnacht, November 9th, 1938. With me is Eva Miriam Wexberg. Welcome.
Welcome.
How old were you when the Nazis stormed into your home?
16.
So you were a young child and you were home alone with your brother. Where were your parents?
My father had left for the United States in October of 1938, and my mother had gone in panic to the police department because it was the custom in Germany and in other parts of Europe that when you left town, you had to go to the police to say that you were leaving town, in this case even the country. And since we had heard that men would be arrested, my mother wanted to be sure that the German police knew that my father was no longer in town.
So she went to tell them that your father was not
Yes.
home. And what was your childhood like up to that point?
How much time do we have? Okay, I come from what we would call today an upper middle class home. My father was a doctor. I had a much younger brother. We lived a very comfortable life, a very Jewish life, but also a very German life. And we lived comfortably. We traveled a lot. We traveled outside Germany quite often because my father never felt 100% comfortable. He would prefer to go to Switzerland or to Italy. But at the beginning, when Hitler came to power, and you're probably going to ask me questions about that later, it was 1933, and as you said, in January, and I live with dates, it was January 30th, 1933 is when Hitler became the chancellor. And I well remember, though that this is not just what you asked me, is that the day after, when I came to school and I went to a general German middle school, Ilse Rosenberg came to me and said, "Now you're going to know what's going to happen to you dirty Jews." So that was the beginning of 1933. I don't know if you want me to go beyond that.
You were in middle school then and feeling the anti-Semitism even then?
Well, yes, but this was at the beginning we thought maybe a single incident. However, it grew by leaps and bounds, but I don't know whether I will get to some of the details later or if you want to ask me another question.
Well, I would like to ask you, you were home alone with your little brother on Kristallnacht. The Nazis were storming into the homes of Jewish citizens and burning down synagogues and destroying their businesses. Okay. That must have been terrifying for you.
Well, first of all, it was terrifying for me. But what really happened is that the morning of Kristallnacht, before they came to the house, and I do have to say that it's a misconception that the SS rampaged through the homes. It was the SR, which were the brown, as you know it as, the brown shirts, who were in civies, so that it would indeed be an uprising by the population about this terrible thing that this little Jewish Polish boy had done in France. It was extremely
Herschel Greenspan.
Yeah, Herschel Greenspan, and who killed this von Rath. Let me share with you in a moment, if I have that time. My mother had enrolled me in a school, for the Berlitz school, which still exists, so I would learn Spanish in a cooking school because we didn't know what life would have for us when we came to the United States, and so I should learn something. So I got on the streetcar, number 24, some things you don't forget, and it made a detour. And I didn't know why it made a detour, but I found out quickly enough, because as I got out of the streetcar, and I'd like you to try and understand what that feeling must have been and was, I stood in front of my synagogue, my family synagogue, which was no more. And it's hard to fathom it. I remember what I wore that day, a navy blue coat, put my hands in my pockets with fists. And all I could think of is that it was the custom in those synagogues to have like a podium where my father's prayer books were, and their prayer shawl, the talit as we call, all of it was totally gone. So needless to say, I didn't go for a Spanish lesson, and I didn't go for a cooking school. Instead, I went to the telephone, and my brother, the little boy you mentioned, who was 8, answered the phone, and then I knew that he had been at school and there was no school. And so I went back home, and I don't know if you want to ask me some other questions from that point on.
Well, standing in front of your synagogue was certainly a moment in time that stood still, yes, that you will never forget.
I will never forget.
And really that was only one synagogue among the hundreds of synagogues throughout Germany, Austria, Vienna, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, that they targeted all on the same day.
That might be of interest to know. You and I, in our previous meeting, never talked about that. All the synagogues in my hometown, and had a fairly large Jewish community of 15,000 Jews, were destroyed except for one, and that one was between 2 buildings attached, and non-Jews lived on either side, so if they would have burned that synagogue down, German citizens would have come to peril of some sort. And as an ironic thing, that synagogue stands today in my hometown, and I have been back there to attend services.
Because of the non-Jews who lived on either side?
Yeah, they would have been, yeah.
So you grew up in Leipzig. Can we show your picture when you were a little girl?
Look how I have changed.
Let's hold this up for just a second, because this is truly special.
It was a nice picture.
You grew up in Leipzig, Germany, and you had a good life up until that, but there was a growing anti-Semitism. Is that correct?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And when you were in school, you felt this?
Yes. One of the things that I wanted to share that might be of interest, because fortunately we live such different lives in the United States, I was allowed, as you may or may not know, that everything that the Nazis did was, it was a German heritage, not just a Nazi heritage, was extremely well prepared. So I was allowed to continue to go to this German school because my father had been an officer in the First World War. And when you were a German, and it was in the army, etc., so I was allowed to go. However, after a year or so after the initial Hitler's rise to the chancellorship, it was customary, I have to backtrack a minute, it was customary in German schools that religion was taught in school, something that we as proud Americans stay away from, because we do not want to emphasize the differences among us and so on. So in one room there were the Catholic kids, where the priest had come, there was a Jewish room where the rabbi had come, and the Protestants. And I will never forget that when we left the room, we had to go to other rooms, not our classrooms. The girls, and it was only a girls' school, would say, "Close your satchels," as we call them, "Jews steal." And when we got back and opened the windows, it stinks because Jews smell. So these may sound like minor things, but it was just an escalation of making you feel not part of the community, the country.
And that was a progressive sort of anti-Jewish feeling that was promoted by the Nazis. Is that correct, when they came into power?
Well, the boycott, the first boycott, happened almost immediately. And I know, for example, that one of my young friends, who was a few years older than I, had a job at a they made railroad cars, and he was thrown out as a Jew in 1934, so that was only a year after, and lots of people lost their jobs at that time.
So Hitler came into power in 1933, and really shortly thereafter they started instigating rules against Jews being in public jobs, civil servants.
Yeah, but not right away, but very shortly thereafter. And as my father used to say, the Germans abused the magnificent heritage because their accuracy and their knowing how to do things, they used it to great, great disadvantage and harm and hurt for the Jews, because Germans are very good at what they do.
Yes,
they were very good at evil as well.
Yes, they were very efficient at that. And why do you think they targeted the Jewish people?
I know you asked me this before. It's really a question that I'm unable to answer. That's our history. And I think some of it, and it may not be everyone's opinion, Jews did not have a country for 2,000 years. They were expelled from Palestine because they always lived in Palestine. The first temple we were thrown out, the second temple we were thrown out. And from there on, Jews, some came back to Palestine, and many stayed in what we call the diaspora. We were dispersed all over the world almost. It's certainly Europe. And when you cannot defend yourself, well, then you're prey to be attacked. Jews, even in other countries before Hitler, were not allowed, for example, to own land. So they chose other professions, such as I said to you once, it's no coincidence that some Jews are called Silverberg and Goldberg because they went into the money business. And since it was frowned upon by the Christians to be usurious, well, the Jews went into the money business. But they never were fully protected. And when things were not good in a country, and maybe that's an oversimplification, but then the Jews were the guinea pigs, and they were thrown out, or they were sometimes killed, and that's our history, which makes it all the more understandable why it was so crucial that finally, after 2,000 years plus, Jews have their own country.
Which is wonderful.
Which is something that in my lifetime I never expected to see, to participate and to visit very often.
So in 1918, Germany lost World War I, and they were made to pay monetary
huge reparations.
Right. And in 1923, the German currency collapsed. So would you say that they were in economic depression and social malaise?
Actually, it had to do, at that time it was called the Weimar Republic, because a city called Weimar. And I should have thought about it. I have boxes for cigars full of money that in the morning might have been worth 1 mark, and 2 hours later, 30 cents. And my husband told me, he was somewhat older than I, that when his father came on the train after he had done whatever his profession was, he handed his son this mass of paper money and said, and he had a list, go shopping for bread and milk, etc., because it was totally worthless in a very short time. History says that one of the reasons that Germany suffered this much, if you can call it suffering, is because the reparations that were inflicted upon them were out of proportion. And so it was fruitful territory for somebody to come and say, I'll make nice on you, we'll do better again.
Right, so in walks Hitler at a time when the country was beaten down.
And he started in 1923, there was a famous putsch, as it's called, an uprising, and he wrote Mein Kampf in 1923, but who read it?
Right, it was actually a coup against the government at the time in 1923, and still he was only in prison for about 9 months.
Yes.
They let him out, and 10 years later he's president of the country.
Right, not president, but chancellor.
Chancellor, thank you.
Then they didn't have a president
right.
anymore, yeah.
So it would seem to me that since they targeted the Jewish people and stole their possessions, looted their businesses, their homes, their jewelry, their art,